We have Atul, who's the founder and managing director of Candid Marketing. And then we have Chitra, who's the agility coach from PM Power Consulting. And then we have Suman, who's the director of Inroads Leadership Development. And of course, myself, Veena Ramagopalan. So Atul, can I ask you to do your intro, please?
Yes, sure, Veena. First of all, thank you very much for having me here. This is a subject that, it's kind of crept up on us over the last few months, and I would love to talk more about it, but it's not one that we've studied, but suddenly it's there. So like you mentioned, I head this business called Candid Marketing. I founded it a couple of decades ago, straight out of business school in Bangalore. And that's really all I've been doing for this 2.5 decades. And I've worked towards building some of the largest brands from all over the world in India, as well as Indian brands, through brand activation and creating experiences. So a lot of interaction with marketing people, with sales people, etc. over the years. And I'm going to try and bring that experience to this discussion.
Thank you so much, Atul. Chitra, would you like to go next?
Sure, Veena. So thank you, Veena and Suman, for having me as part of this panel. It's great to be here. So I've spent most of my career in tech. Started out with being an avionics engineer with Daimler Research, and then spent a lot of time in file and operating systems engineering when I worked at Novell, and about 10 years spent at NetApp, all in data storage. Have been very passionate about product engineering and product development. It's where I cut my teeth and experience on many things. I also got involved as a mentor and coach for women in tech, and have been very actively part of the Grace Hopper celebration for women in tech for many, many years now. I also coach kids to play basketball, since I was a basketball player for many years myself. And I'm a yoga enthusiast, and now coach companies, organizations, teams, and individuals on agility and product engineering excellence. Thank you.
Thank you, Chitra. Sumit, would you like to go?
Yeah, thanks, Veena. Really excited to be part of this group. My name is Suman Ghosh. I'm the co-founder and director of Inroads Leadership Development. We are a boutique leadership development firm based out of Bangalore. Among other things, we do work on high performance mindset, organizational culture, diversity and inclusion, where we do women leadership programs along with Veena, and emotional intelligence, which is the topic which is very close to my heart. I wrote a book on EQ, which is called From Command to Empathy, which is published by HarperCollins. So yeah, very, very passionate about this topic, and do visit our YouTube channel. We have a whole bunch of webinars and expert chats and blogs. Prior to Inroads, I was in senior roles in primarily large multinational companies. Yeah, so that's kind of my background. And my education is I'm an engineer from IIT Kharagpur and an MBA from IIM Bangalore. So Atul talked about these things we didn't learn. And let me tell you, none of these things we're talking about I learned in any of these places. But so it was quite a journey. So thanks again.
Thank you, Suman. So about me, a bit about me. I have a versatile experience of 25 years plus, which is a very unique combination of corporate and defense. I'm an ex-naval officer from the first batch of women officers in the Navy. Post that, the corporate bug bit me as well. I did a very long tenure in corporate, held various senior strategic and leadership roles. I'm the co-founder of Inroads Leadership Development, very passionate about connecting with people, sharing my experience, coaching and mentoring professionals and leaders. And of course, the other passion which I carry, like Chitra, is also coaching and mentoring women professionals and leaders. And of course, enjoy traveling, cooking, and yoga. As Atul mentioned, so this topic is a very interesting topic for all of us, right? Ever since this pandemic has hit us, the COVID has hit us, and this work from home has become the new norm for all of us. and virtually, connecting virtually has become a routine for everything and anything. Be it probably your team meetings, your one-on-ones, doing your major brainstorm sessions, or it could be you're closing the deal with a client. So probably a few months back when it was discussion with client, me and Suman would have never thought of doing it virtually, but we are doing all of that virtually today. But one question which probably it's coming into all our mind is that how do we really make this online virtual connection which we are engaging in into much more engaging and experiential, more than probably the face-to-face which we have all used to. And is presence, which is what we're going to talk about, really different from what we are used to when we were doing face-to-face? And let's really hear from the experts which we have in our panel today. So I would be moderating this session, and really pleasure to have with me all these experts. So let me start with Atul. So Atul, what does presence actually mean to you? And why do you think this presence, quote unquote, is really important?
Veena, I think, you mentioned about the way our lives have changed and, the way things are different from the way they used to be. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to dial back to talk about presence as a whole. And, I do believe that any situation, any kind of situation that life puts us in, and I'm talking about personal life or work life, there are two very important aspects of form and content. In any kind of relationship interaction, there is the content of what you're trying to communicate, what you're trying to say, what you're feeling. And then there is the form of actually getting that across to the people, that person or people that you're trying to get it across to you. And obviously both are important. And I think we realize that. And there is a tendency among some people to believe that, content matters more than form. And I may grudgingly, agree that, put a gun to my head, I would say content is more important than form, but form plays a very, very important role in doing what we need to do in communication. And, if I was to say that presence in many ways is about how do you make sure your form is right to get the content across. Now, content also plays a very important part in the way we present ourselves and create presence for ourselves. And people will listen and absorb, and it makes it easier for us to get our point across to people and to convince others. Communication very often is about convincing, whether it's sales, whether it's creating consensus in a team, etc. And that's a lot easier when you consider both content and form when you communicate. And this is where I feel preparation is key. And preparation is the most important thing. And I've not even reached the point where we're talking about communication in the virtual world, but in the physical world also, how you prepare for something is crucial, because that develops confidence in what you're trying to communicate, both form and content. So that's where I would like to leave it, that it's all about preparation leading to confidence in both form and content.
Thank you so much, Atul. Chitra, would you share your thoughts on this word presence, and why do you think is important?
Thank you, Veena. And after Atul's given us that wonderful lead into presence, for me, it starts with bringing yourself to any gathering or situation with intent, with purpose of simply being present at first. So what does that mean? I mean, when we are in either physical spaces together or in a virtual environment, I would actually say it is a real environment rather than saying virtual. So I'll say remote environment. I think what matters is what of ourselves that we are bringing. And like Atul said, irrespective of what you're going to say or what you will listen to or what you will receive, I think preparing for such a scenario is important, and working on yourself.
I don't understand what you were saying.
I'm sorry? Are you able to hear me?
Chitra, go ahead. I think the gentleman was maybe talking to someone else.
I see. Okay. All right. Yeah. So I think it involves preparing yourself in terms of what, understanding what you're going in with. And I think one thing that all of us are very well aware of, even when whether you're face-to-face or whether you're remote, is you are always sensing what's happening in the situation. You are processing and you are responding. So to me, presence is the precursor to what sensing, processing, and responding entail in any environment when you are with others. Okay, be it a meeting, be it a discussion, be it a presentation, be it one-way, multi-way conversations. This is what presence means to me. And preparing for it in terms of being ready for that discussion. For example, in remote environments, making sure that you are not distracted, and ensuring that you are completely available to others for that discussion.
Thank you, Chitra. Suman, would you like to add to what Chitra and Atul mentioned?
Sure. Just to build on what Chitra said, I think one of it is just presence, just being there, right? What she said is simply being there. Again, it sounds very simple, but hard to do. And there are reasons for that. It's very difficult for us to hold attention. But there's another type of presence, which I'm sure all of us have seen. There's some people walk into the room and they immediately command the room and everybody is sitting up and taking notice and listening to them, right? And some others, unfortunately, don't have that capacity. They're talking and nobody's listening to them. So that is also another type of presence. They're kind of linked. And that is what we call executive presence. And in fact, we hear this term more and more in the companies that we work in, or leadership presence. Some people call it LP. Interestingly, leadership presence, I mean, again, there are lots of elements in it, but it's not a measure of performance like what leadership is. It's more a measure of image. So it's really about perception. And that's what makes it very interesting and also very complicated, because a lot of it is based on bias. So there's a lot of research done. So essentially, just the image that you portray, people immediately get a sense of, does this person have what it takes to get the job done? So that's a very immediate thing that people kind of perceive. And that has many, many elements also. How you speak, how you act, how you appear, all of that. So again, EP doesn't, for instance, when it comes to promotion, EP doesn't get you a promotion, but a lack of EP definitely stagnates your chances of getting promoted. So that's why EP becomes a very interesting thing. And research shows that almost 26% of what it takes to get promoted is just executive presence. So I'll stop there. I think there are other elements of EP we'll talk about as we go along.
Thank you, Suman. So just to build on to what, Suman, Atul and Chitra just mentioned. So maybe, let me share, what comes to my mind, when it comes to presence. So for me, when I say presence, it's all about being mindful. When I say mindful of, really staying focused in terms of what's happening. Like say, for example, right now. So staying focused in terms of, this is what's happening here, right? In terms of mindful of how I speak, how I listen, how mindful of others in the room, mindful of that there are people who are, in the audience who are connected here today. Yeah, mindful of the environment which is there for us. So for me, presence, when I hear this word presence, if it's about being mindful of that. And the other aspect is also about all of you have said, it's about really creating that or leaving that impact when you enter the room or when you leave the room. What do people perceive about you when you enter or you leave the room? So all that put together from, is what resonates when I hear this word presence. So moving on, now that we've heard, what's present. So coming to, Atul, to you itself, in the context of virtual, since we're talking about virtual presence here in this webinar, can you share, your experience in terms of, from your own field, in terms of your marketing aspect, How does this translate the virtual presence?
I think, Veena, I think what we have to realize is that to me, moving forward in our lives, this is going to be a hugely important aspect of our work lives. For many, many years, for decades, we talked about the importance of the skill of public speaking. And as we know, there's many a book written, whether it's a Dale Carnegie or a Mortimer Adler, in terms of how to win friends, influence people, command a room in terms of meetings, how to listen, how to speak, how to listen before speaking, etc., etc. And I think what we have to realize is that being effective through this medium, the medium that we are using, in fact, right now, is going to play a very important part in building careers for all of us in the future. It might vary a little bit from role to role. Some roles will require it that much more, and some a little less. But then that's the way the real world communication aspect was true as well. In my experience, as I was mentioning when we were kind of introducing ourselves, that I do a lot of work in the marketing and selling space, and as a result, there's a lot of communication that happens with clients. In most cases, those are clients whom I personally know well, and in any communication, empathy for people on the other side is a very important part of communication, face to face as well as in a virtual scenario. So I think building that into your communication, and I know we're going to go deeper into that to kind of see what goes into building it. But I think, and of course, the other aspect is within the team. People whom I'm used to seeing every day, putting my arm around people every day, and that arm around a person is a very important part of communication, which unfortunately is not available to me right now. So, finding a way to change my behavior to influence other people's behavior without a physical common ground is going to become a very, very important aspect in our career building over the next few years. So I think that's something that I cannot overemphasize.
Thank you, Atul. So Chitra, would you like to add to what just Atul mentioned and share from your own experience, in terms of how does this topic really translate to virtual world?
Yeah, and I think, thanks, Veena. I think Atul brought it out beautifully, saying that the whole aspect of physically being present and physical gestures like a pat or even, gently raising your hand like this, almost saying, if I may, those are things that are so important. And a lot of us actually built what we have come to understand, at least what I have come to understand as presence in a discussion or a meeting. And to do a complete 180 on that because of a remote environment is going to take a lot of unlearning and relearning. So it almost reminds me of a situation where, there's a product manager in a meeting, and why I took the role of a product manager is this is one individual that has to deal with different kinds of stakeholders, is accountable for everything, yet responsible for nothing, and how does this individual, is, let's say, running a roadmap review in the middle of a quarter. There is engineering, finance, marketing, sales, support, all these people sitting inside, and each one waiting for this next product or feature to be released. You come into that meeting. Imagine all of this happening in a remote environment. And I think if you look at it from the point of view of the product manager, he or she is already sensing what's going to happen. Okay, so and then in the discussion, you will have contrarian points of view. So I think being present and sensing in a remote environment take on a completely different meaning. I think it's going to need different levels of patience, different kinds of what we've come to know as active listening, I think will really be put to the test, and perception, right? So what do you tune into? What do you try and zoom in on? Okay, it could be tone, it could be inflection, it could be pauses, all of these and more so virtually become very, very important. So even from a personal experience, it's going to be a whole lot of different kind of experimentation. And like I had mentioned earlier, while you are receiving information, others are receiving what you are trying to say or convey. And then everyone is trying to process and respond. So how do you get to a balance of this trifecta, I think is going to be challenging for us in this sort of a remote environment.
Thank you so much. So I think, so what we, from hearing from what Atul and Chitra mentioned, so it's all about, from your physical world, how do you really translate to the remote world, which we are all in, right? And which is really going to be very important from, our career success point of view, probably in terms of, deep diving in terms of the various important discussions which we have. So Suman, since you're a leadership coach and you have led various programs in terms of, consulted various organizations in terms of leadership development, can you share from your experience, what are key elements which one needs to take into account, or, key pillars, I would say, one needs to take into account in terms of developing or elevating presence itself?
Sure. So, hearing Atul, Chitra, yourself, Veena, one thing is coming out very clearly that it involves multiple elements, right, which make up presence, whether it is content or form or even, the subtle things of patting somebody on the back. All of them actually comprise executive presence. So having so many elements also means there are many definitions, many frameworks. So let me talk about one which I really like, and we use this for our sessions. Like if somebody comes and says, hey, can you build executive presence for my people? How do we attack it? What are the things that we need to look at, right? So the one which we are basically focusing on is one from Sylvia Ann Hewlett. She's a Cambridge graduate, an economist. And this one I really like. One is that it is simple. It's easy to understand. It kind of pulls in all the elements. And the best thing is it's very research-based. So what she's saying is there are essentially 3 parts. The second and third is easy to understand. It's how you speak and how you appear, right? So because those are, first appear is also about first impressions, which are again very important. But the third element, which is gravitas, and we've heard this in the word quite often, right? Gravitas. Some people just have that gravitas in which they can command a room. So what does that mean? Now, gravitas itself again is basically a set of behaviors. Very quickly, what it entails is that even before you enter the room, there is something that precedes you, which is your reputation. So reputation is a big one, right? Then in terms of how you act, whether you're confident, do you show poise, are you decisive, somebody who's able to take decisions, not flip-flopping, right?
Correct.
So that could be another component. Somebody who has the vision to take the company forward, right? The people believe that yes, this person has the vision. And also how does this is more on the what, in terms of how they operate. Do they operate from an area of integrity? Do they actually mean what they say, right? If they say they'll do a job, do they end up doing the job, right? So that's about integrity. Do they speak the truth, or are they constantly kind of, depending on the people in front of them saying different things? And we've seen people like that. So it's integrity. And the last but not the least is, of course, emotional intelligence, right? Able to read the room, the empathy, all of that. I can't stress more. We've talked about that. So that's about the gravitas, which I think is very important. It's just that thing which is required. And of course, communication, which is the next part, is again very big. It's about how you speak, the content, as Atul has put it. But Atul, to your point, I think the form is probably even more important than the content. They say it's not what you say, but it's how you say it. I think that's even more important. So there she talks about 2-3 things. And when I say there, she says it's all based on research, which is the nice thing. So they asked thousands of executives and they actually compiled the data. And within communication, the first thing they said was it needs to be concise and compelling. And to me, this is, again, as I said, it's very hard. This is something we strive for all our lives, whether it's offline or online, right? To be able to speak concise and speak, compelling. It just makes it harder when it's online, right? Because you just have that much less attention span. And there is a little bit of time lag. So you don't know, people won't interrupt you unless you kind of You should know when to stop and things like that. Of course, next is commanding the room, which I think is very important. And we'll talk more about that. Being assertive and reading the room, which is kind of linked to that as well. And the other two, the last two was also very interesting. Somebody who has a bit of sense of humor. And of course, body language. And the third is appearance. And in order of priority, the first most important was gravitas. The second was communication. The third was appearance. Yeah. And I think a lot of these elements will keep coming up, but I thought it'll be good to kind of give the framework so that we can tie it all together.
Thank you so much, Suman. So now that you've said, gravitas, communication, and appearance, right? These are the three key pillars which you said. And you also said that, it's about, in terms of the communication, how you speak, it even becomes more harder in the virtual, world. So, Atul, the question to you is, in terms of, this communication itself, how, is communication for presence, in the context of virtual, what are the key elements, which you need to keep in mind, when it comes to really connecting in a virtual, when it say, for example, how do you really engage? Like someone said, how do you really engage, own, command the room? How do you do that in case of virtual? Can you share some of the strategies which has worked for you?
Yeah, sure. Veena, before I do that, I'm going to say that, whenever I get a chance to speak on a panel like this, I always look forward not only to be able to say what I want to, but I'll be able to listen to, people on the panel. And I have to say that this one is already a huge success for me, because in the last 5 minutes, based on what Suman just spoke, I have picked up my learning for the day, in terms of what he talked about gravitas. Suddenly, in so many ways has made the penny drop for me to understand how various elements which I may have thought were to some extent random, but obviously are not random, I can suddenly join the dots in my head. And that whole thing about gravitas, the integrity, and the confidence, the poise, the decisiveness, all of those things suddenly come together. And I think what Suman said, and I'd love to possibly have him answer a question for me when we do the Q&A, which comes to my mind right now, is that can gravitas be taught and learned? Can gravitas be developed by yourself, for yourself? I'd love to know the answer to that. Now, going back to what you were saying, sorry, Veena, I've taken a minute.
Sure.
But this was, it was bubbling for me, and I had to get it out of my system.
Okay.
I think one of the crucial things in terms of building presence and having that communication, especially in the remote scenario, and I love the way we're talking about it as remote rather than virtual. I prefer that the Chitra mentioned remote rather than virtual, because that's a much nicer word. I think picking up visual cues based on communication that you're having, that becomes very important. If you are having repeat meetings or interactions with people remotely, then you must build almost like a compendium of behavior patterns of your team members, of your leaders, of your subordinates, so that you can sense when do you have that person's attention and when you don't. It's an important part of selling through the screen, understanding customers and clients very often. And when I present to clients, very often there are more than one. There are 3, 4, 5 people on the client side who are listening to a presentation, and each of them is having actually an independent experience, because they're not in the same room. So one of them may have their spouse sitting in the same room with them potentially, and I can't see that person. One of them could have a child in the other room screaming, or going through a class that the child is not enjoying. There could be multiple such scenarios. All of us are going through this right now, and we have to be empathetic towards that. I have always believed that presentations and meetings are like theatrical performances. And for that theatrical performance, you must prepare for it, you must practice it, and it must be performed like theater, right? There is only one critical difference, which is that in theater, you can play a role that you're not. But in a presentation or a meeting, you must not do that. you cannot do that because then you come across as fake. So I think it's all about theater, but you're playing yourself. So the preparation and the performance and the practice must be that of as if you're going to deliver a theater on stage, but yourself. And and to that extent, the same thing must come across and preparation has to be even that much more, and the performance has to be even that much more. But you have to understand the audience. That's crucial to the process.
So just building on Atul, just another follow-up question on this, because you said it's like a theatrical performance is what you're doing, right? So what about spontaneity? Is that important?
Yes, it is very much, because, and even more so in physical meetings and presentations, because it's interactive, right? So to that, yes, I must add a caveat based on what you're saying, that it's almost like interactive theater. So you're
Correct.
also reading the audience and maybe changing your performance accordingly. Yes, I would agree with that. Yes.
Okay, thank you. So moving on, building on to what Atul just said, he was mentioning about it's also about listening to what's happening, in the room, right? Or what the audience is saying. So how, the question is to you, Suman, how important is actually emotional intelligence and empathy? And how do you really demonstrate that? See, in case of when you are in face-to-face environment, it's probably very obvious, right? How you can demonstrate that. But how do you really demonstrate the emotional intelligence and empathy part of it in the virtual environment? And also the listening part of it. How important is it?
I think it's extremely important. And as I said earlier, I'll reinforce again, it's always tough, and it's even tougher in a virtual environment. We talked about commanding the room, and that's the image that comes to our mind when you talk of, gravitas, where you talk about executive presence. But often we fail to realize that commanding the room has a prerequisite, which is reading the room. We have this image of, larger than life figure coming in, towering personality with a booming voice and, completely taking over. That's not how real life works. Right? That might work with stage presence, but that doesn't work with people you're working with, because there's a lot of other stuff that goes on with it. So the prerequisite is about reading the room. And I think a lot of the things like what you mentioned, Atul, also mentioned, that is really about empathy. It's really about understanding why the customer is there. I think it all starts with a mindset. I completely agree that it's a theatrical performance. And over time, it dawned on me that when we do programs, it's really about, you're not informing, but you're performing, because that's when the real message goes through. So first is the mindset change in terms of, you're not the hero, the audience is. So you have to be empathetic in terms of understanding why are they even there in the room? Why are they listening to you? What is important to them? Okay, so that's, I think, and that is I call it a mindset, because, you have to be focused on that. And you're constantly reading the room, understanding each, the mood of the room, sensing the mood of the room, reading the people, reading the boss. You also want to see how the boss is reacting, and constantly calibrating your response based on that. Okay, and I think, and doesn't it go back to basics of public speaking? We've heard this here also. Public speaking is also not about just going and speaking. It's really about reading the room and calibrating your response. And I think that goes to empathy. And because you need to understand their needs, you need to understand where they're coming from. In the context of COVID, the other thing that comes to mind is, and I think Atul touched upon that, is that, Atul, you mentioned about the pat on the back. Now, what's happening is typically earlier when we used to get on a call, it was about work, right? So we'd get on a bridge and say, and we'd talk on work, but there were other avenues where you could talk of other things other than work. You'd meet in a canteen or you'd meet in the corridor and just have an exchange and say, hi, how are things? Now, we also must understand that opportunity is not there. So as leaders, I think it's important when we speak to someone, best is not to start the discussion saying, hey, where are you with your numbers? But to say, how are you? How are you doing? Right? So that is very important, because people have high levels of anxiety. And if you're just talking work, and we are we probably don't even realize, we are not mindful. We need to be present to understand that, the times are different. We don't have those other opportunities. And I think there the empathy also becomes very important. And we need to train ourselves to just get in. In fact, a lot of companies are doing different things. Sometimes you can have unscheduled time. So let's say a meeting starts at 4, you can log in at 3:45. Just spend the first 15 minutes talking about things other than work. It goes a long way in reducing anxiety of people. Otherwise, we just tend to jump into work and say, hey, have you met your numbers and why have you not met it? Right? So I think empathy again plays a very important role there, much more in a virtual environment.
So when you said, connecting beyond work, so it just reminded me of, recently my husband was taking his drink and sitting in front of his team. So I said, what's happening? So it was a Friday. So he said, now we're connecting, we call it a CGIF, and we're connecting virtually with our own independent drinks. So it's, probably you need to probably build some kind of, the relationship with your teams and find intelligent ways to build that in this remote world, right? Yeah. So moving on.
I get reminded of a story. If you allow me, I'll just narrate this story.
Yeah, sure.
So we were in a presentation, and Veena, you were there. So without naming the client, we were in front of a very important customer. He was a very senior guy, and we did our presentation, and everything went fine. At the end of it, after everything was over, we asked him how was it. He said everything was fine, and then we had to probe a little bit and nudge him, saying what could have been better. And I still remember his response. He gave a one-word response. He said, "It could have been a little more nuanced." Yeah. That's a loaded statement. What he was trying to tell us is that you guys should have probably read the room a little better. Okay. And I pondered over this. We discussed this, Veena. The point is, if I think back, that room had very, very senior people, right? Many of them were global leaders who had come from all over the world. They were sitting there. So there was a cultural context which we were not so used to, right? So it's not only about measuring moods, measuring people. It's also looking at cultures. And I think to me, that word nuanced was nothing more than, hey, take time to read the room, right? It could just mean that extra pause, that extra, permission to, asking whether are we on the right track or whatever, because they were just much more senior people. So their requirements were very different.
Thanks, Suman, to narrate that story. So Chitra, moving on to you from your experience, in terms of product strategy and, really handling large technical teams. How can really one keep energy and motivation? And really, how do you really get people who are probably, I wouldn't say it's only in virtual world, probably even it's in the face-to-face world, they are hesitant to speak or voice their opinion. And how, does it translate, for managers or, people to really get them to speak?
Very nice question, Veena. Thank you. And having listened to all of what's being spoken about right now, I would echo Atul's sentiment saying that I think my learning just went up several notches. So thanks for that. Yeah, I think, working in remote teams, there's several instances that come to mind. Having worked with teams all over the world, particularly engineering teams, and when you are driving innovation, can be quite challenging. And you may never have the opportunity to meet that team face-to-face or the individual face-to-face yet. Like what Suman said, the whole interaction begins with several nuances. Understanding who that individual is. I remember one instance where one of our most brilliant architects that I worked with probably had written certain protocols with respect to communication protocols like Fiber Channel and iSCSI even before I was born. Okay, and I had to work with this individual. Very reticent, very to the point, and could be fairly condescending at times. While that used to deter a lot of people on my team, over a period of time, there were slow and subtle ways in which this individual began to reveal himself. And what we understood behind the reticence, behind the certain level of anger, vindictiveness, was this whole thing that we should all be better, you know, and would sometimes come down very hard on especially very young engineers who simply wouldn't understand where a particular comment was coming from if they were writing code in a certain way. I think it took quite a few, and then we began noticing certain patterns. And to recall what Atul said, behavioral patterns. And the interesting thing is, we began noting the bug fix numbers which contain this individual's comments, and lo and behold, we noticed a pattern. There were so many teaching moments there. There were so many gems of information that were revealed, and there was no way we would have figured those things out on our own. This person was bringing a wealth of experience, technical brilliance through all of those things, and it just took us that time. So one thing which I find happening today with some of the teams that we're coaching is that you have to give yourself that time. And to tie in what Suman very beautifully said in terms of empathy, is don't rush behind numbers and results and when can I get this feature or when this can be done. But I think now more than ever, giving people time, space to reflect, to respond, to mull over things and then come back. I think these inflection points of pauses become more important. So while I do hear that a lot of technical teams are taking a lot more time to get things done, I think once they hit that point of getting to know each other and getting into a rhythm, then things go really fast. But from the starting point, and especially when you are working in a space where it's discovering new things and innovation, you really can't put a timeline to it. It's always like Professor Amar Bose of Bose Corporation said, right? He said, don't ask me when something will be ready. When it's done, the world will know of it. And we all know the caliber and quality of what Bose produces, right? So I think that is what we need to bring to the environment of remote working, even more so now, is allow for discussions, allow for idea, nurture and harvest as many ideas, thoughts, and processes as you can, and ensure that that will build an environment of collaboration, of trust, of respect, all of which I think for which empathy is the underlying factor. And then teams will certainly go places. And this is what, Meena, to your question, managers, team leads, or senior architects can bring in terms of their presence to virtual meetings. And with respect to introverts, I've seen simple tips like, people have a daily stand-up meeting. And I saw this happen recently in a 17-member team that was working from 3 different locations, and the daily stand-up meeting would be done in 20 minutes, where everyone would have spoken, given their, focusing on 3 things. So I think one thing with introverts is they like to be to the point, they want to be heard, and yet don't want to speak too much. So I'd say honor and respect that. And if you have to set up time with them and understand what else is going on, I would say do it one-on-one. And bring the essence of those discussions in to ensure that this individual is heard. This individual also gets the opportunity to speak.
Thanks, Chitra. Let me give a break to Veena from asking questions. So let me ask her a question. So Veena, a question for you. We've been talking about a lot of the non-verbal aspects.
Correct.
How important are some of these non-verbal aspects, like gestures, eye contact, body language, in the context of virtual, what's your view?
So if you ask me, Suman, it's extremely important. In fact, I would say, from my own experience of, these past few months where we're doing more and more virtual meeting. And in fact, all my calls where when I'm doing virtual meeting, one thing which has helped me to connect better, especially when I'm doing coaching, is even though, I'm not there face to face, is actually keeping my camera on. And I would really, that's the first tip which I would really share, with the entire audience here, that don't shy away from keeping your cameras on. Because if you really have to connect and make an impact and make your visual presence felt to the other side, first and foremost, we need to keep our camera on. The second thing, what we also need to understand is that in terms of that camera, when you moment you switch on, obviously you're also exposing yourself and the environment which is also behind you. So it's very, very important that you not only take care of in terms of, how you are groomed and well presented. That's of course very important. It's not that just because you're in the virtual world, you just get up from the bed and then you get onto the call. That obviously will leave a different perception or an impression. Of course, I did notice that, in the initial few days of, this lockdown, this was happening. But now people have started realizing that this is what is, the home has become office. So you need to actually do all that what you were doing in office, when you are in calls. So that appearance is definitely important. But also the environment. When I say environment, it's about whatever is seen through your camera is actually being visible to the other people. And that can actually cause some bit of a distraction. Right? So it's very important that you are mindful of the background which you are exposing to the other side. And so your cluttered rooms, of course, we need to be empathetic about the place where you are and all of it. But as far as possible, declutter that and, and focus should be on you, right? So that is a very, very important aspect. The other thing which you just mention about the camera or the eye contact, that's a very, very important element. And I was just reading a research paper recently where it just said that, if you really want to maintain an eye contact in a virtual meeting, you need to actually look at that, that camera dot. And that's where you're going to create much more, impact in terms of what you're saying. And the other aspect also is if you're really in a room where you have a big conference or a big team meeting going on, then the other aspect is also, probably, making like a timer where you not only look at the center of your screen, but also look at the right and the left time to time so that everybody in the room feels that you are, listening to them or you do acknowledge their presence. And in terms of gestures, I would say it's, what probably is shown is more your hands. And so it's important that the hand movements need to be aligned to, what you speak. That's very, very important. The other thing is, leave out again the distractions. I've seen, in some of my calls, like if you're not speaking, you're actually busy doing something else with your hand, right? So that also causes distraction because you kept your camera on. I would say if you really want to do something with your hand, best is to, mute at that moment of time, your video so that you're not distracting others. The body language, I think it goes without saying. It's pretty much, probably I would say it's like face-to-face where you do, portray a confident body language, especially, keeping your shoulders back. And because your head and the shoulder is going to dominate the screen, when you are in the virtual meeting. So that's, you need to really pull your shoulder back and really keep your head, and also be aware of the headroom, the space which is there above your head. And so that your frame, your camera frame actually shows only your face and, your shoulder part of it, and not, any other thing which is going to distract your audience. So this is what I have to share, when it comes to the non-verbal cues as well as the environment part. I think the lastly, I would say the technology, so we all are, have to be aware that, like I also would connect back to what Atul said, the preparation. So I think in this case, the preparation also involves you check your internet, your audio, your video, all the aspects, especially when you are really getting into a very important call. In fact, there was a joke going around in one of the meeting, where somebody said you have to spend probably 10-15 minutes, really understanding if everybody is there and we're able to hear each other. And then after 15 minutes is where actually the meeting starts. So get all that sorted. So that's also very important aspect in terms of your technology and whatever tool you might be using, Zoom, Skype, I don't know, there's so many other, tools which are available. So be familiar with, those features which are there, the key features which you would be using. And that also, leaves an impression and an impact. Yeah. So with that, that basically, these are certain things which I wanted to share, Suman, related to nonverbal cues and the environment part of it. So moving on.
So Veena and Suman just, I remembered one thing. People have different ways of expression. And one thing that's worked with people who are not very vocal or well, confident about talking, one thing that I have discovered is that if you ask them to draw and then talk to that picture, they actually do a beautiful job of it. So try to explore different mediums through which you can bring out what people want to say. And I think that's incumbent on the facilitator or the moderator of the meeting or the owner of that discussion, if you will, is that if you really want people to speak up or express themselves, it's okay for them to show a picture and talk to it. What comes out is very beautiful. And this was a learning that I had recently when working with a rural NGO, and they were all very hesitant to turn on their cameras, and yet they had such a wealth of ideas to share about the projects that they were working on. And then finally, one of them drew on a sheet of paper and just held it up like this and very beautifully explained. And that explanation, even though we could not see his face, was through the voice, the expression, the intonation. And so I just thought of putting this out there to share.
So, excellent point you're making, actually. I think just to add on to what you just said, Chitra, I think all these tools also have this whiteboard. So a lot of people have asked me this question, like now, when I was doing brainstorm, I had a whiteboard in the room and I could do all of it, in terms of, bringing the ideas together. I think we need to also utilize this technology very well in terms of the tooling which is there with us, probably use this chat aspect. Now I already see many people writing many questions and which we need to respond to. So, use all these aspects to make your, interaction much more effective and experiential. So moving on and building on to this topic, since we've spoken about gravitas, we've spoken about, the non-verbal aspects, we've spoken about appearance. Atul, the question is to you. So obviously in all these meetings, we do make decisions, we manage sometimes conflicts, we're probably negotiating certain important discussions with the client, or probably generating new ideas, right? When it comes, so how different is it from face-to-face to virtual? Does virtual really pose some challenges in these things?
See, Veena, this is an area where I must admit I'm slightly conflicted. And I was trying to kind of think about this area, and the reason, the deeper, the level at which I'm conflicted on this is, the experience that all of us are have gone through in the last 100 days, approximately 100 days of work from home from the middle of March till now. There are 2-3 extraordinary aspects to this. The first is that this was relatively sudden for all of us, right? It wasn't something we planned for. Yes, COVID was developing in China, etc., etc. But I don't think any of us thought that suddenly we're all going to be working from home for 100 days. 100 days is a long time, right? Number two, it is almost complete and total remote work. It's not as if, you know, a lot of organizations and verticals and categories and workspaces have a work from home policy where you can work from home 2 days, 3 days, 4 days in a week, right? But this is complete and total work from home for everybody, which is really, really drastic. So these two aspects in my mind, you know, make this what I would call a really extraordinary situation. And I'm not sure whether we should entirely be planning for this scenario. If we are thinking about this aspect of presence and planning for presence and gravitas, etc., we should probably be planning for a one notch below, which is number one. Now we all know that there could be an extreme work from home situation. We've been doing it for 100 days. It's possible we may have to do it for another 30, 50, 100 days. I don't know. Or we may go back to work for 100 days and then do it again for 50 days.
Or probably this might become a new norm itself.
Possible. Second, it is also possible that, and it's already started with some companies, that 20% of the people are going in on one day and then another 25 on the next day, and there's a rolling roster kind of situation happening. So you are meeting some people. So a boss is potentially meeting part of his team on one day and part of his team on another day and so on. So there is that opportunity of having a physical interaction. The reason I'm bringing out these two things is that when you are planning for larger aspects like, you know, developing new ideas, innovation, negotiation, or even, you know, ironing out conflicts and things like that. If I had to, and honestly, in the last 100 days, I have actually been faced by a lot of these very extreme situations, because not only is all this happening, but the economic scenario is in the doldrums. So we're looking at reducing salaries, as everybody knows, reducing workforce, in fact, in many cases, which has its own set of emotional, strong, extreme emotional aspect to it, across cities. So it's not just, I mean, there was a time I could just, you know, fly to Bombay, fly to Bangalore, fly to Delhi and do what I had to, sit with the team, give the bad news, put my arm around a person. Can't do any of those things, right?
Correct.
So I think what's important is finding different ways to do it. So one has to realize that earlier, if you were trying to, and I'll take an example, if you were trying to address conflict in a team of 3, 4, 5, 6 people in a team, you could do it by having communication in a room, making sure communication across people happens in a good way. But it's very hard to do that in a remote situation through a screen. So I have found that it becomes very, very important to have communication at multiple levels. So you speak to a team together, then you break it up and speak to individuals or smaller groups, have a communication with them, then go back to possibly the larger group to have the communication again, and then again to a smaller group or to individuals, and then go again to the larger group. So the layers of communication have to be increased, in my opinion. This is also particularly true if you're trying to do innovation and new ideas, etc., because everybody's got an opinion and one person doesn't like the other person's opinion. So you have to manage that bridging using tools, online tools, having sidebar meetings to develop consensus. It's a much harder thing to do, emotionally much tougher on the leader and on the person who's trying to bring that together. It's emotionally much harder. But one has to accept that that has to be done, because if you don't do that, the fissures and the cracks in the team will be deeper, faster, much faster, because they don't have the option of coming to you as often as they would like. So you have to kind of, you know, work harder on that process. Add to that, then whenever you're communicating and if you're talking about something uncomfortable, bad news, etc., I can only see you in a window. You know, your wife might be sitting right next to you and I'm giving you bad news and she's hearing it as well. Yes. And we all know that we behave differently depending on who's around. Yeah. Right. So I'm not able to express myself the way I want to because I've got 2 people sitting in the room with me or within earshot in the next room, etc., etc., etc. So I'm not really saying what I want to. You think, wait a minute, why isn't Atul really, you know, this is not the way he normally behaves. If I would have said this to him, he would have responded far more vociferously, but he's not saying it. What's going on? He's behaving strange. And then you are behaving in a different way because I'm behaving strange. And then, it's a downward spiral from there. So that aspect needs to be kind of taken into account as well. And as Veena was saying earlier, that some people don't have their video on. So you're communicating with a blank screen then. And, that just complicates things beyond any manageable levels.
Yeah.
Coming back to presence, in the good old days when you're in a conference room, constantly people are reading you, right? So it's how confidently you walk in, how you shake hands, how you quickly make eye contact, right? Even how you stand, all of them is signaling about your executive presence. Now, we don't have any of that in the online world, right? You show up as someone on the screen, and the next best thing of Gravitas is to communicate. But before you can say anything, there's this meek little voice which says, you're on mute. So that there goes your complete communication.
There goes your gravitas.
Gravitas, there goes your gravitas. So it makes it immensely challenging, right? In terms of, but you have to overcompensate in some other areas is what I feel, right? Yeah. Chitra, you were wanting to say something.
Actually listening to y'all, I think very, very exciting and energetic conversation. But yes, you're right, Suman. I think a heightened sense of listening. And it's almost, I feel you must. One thing that, especially when Atul was talking, today the situation is such that every little thing is just amplified. It is being amplified hundreds of times in people's minds. It is just the environment of what's going on.
Yeah.
And I think given that it is, and this is also coming from my experience as a Corona warrior in the first 42 days, is simply, I think we have to double down on two things, empathy and compassion. Okay, and I sincerely hope that is something that we all build within ourselves tremendously. I would say, can we just set aside some of the numbers that we were always looking at and focus more on the people? Because a lot of, I think, what people bring into, and like you said, Suman, suddenly, sometimes you're able to see a face, sometimes you're not able to see a face. So I think this sensing, honoring everyone's presence. Maybe we could have a follow-up session on this, but I would love to hear people in terms of how they sense. To me, it's almost a conversation, I know I'm bringing in something a little personal here, but sometimes, like, I have the practice of just lighting a lamp in the evening and sitting quietly. And I feel giving myself that time and honoring my own presence is very important. Can I do that for others? Can I do that for everybody? And make everyone feel that, yes, we are all there together. We are all there for each other. I think that is going to make a huge difference in this way of working, whatever it might be.
Excellent. Very well said. Yeah. Hi, welcome back, Veena. We had lost you in between.
Yeah. I know I have faced some issues with the technology. So
welcome back. Welcome back.
Yeah. And I could not get back to Zoom for some reason. Yeah. So have you done with the last question in terms of advice to help you stand out?
No. So maybe you can do that.
Yeah. So maybe, we can just take a moment where each of us can just share a tip or advice which you would like to give to our audience today, which will help you to stand out in this virtual environment.
Sure. So
would you like to go, Atul, first?
Yeah, sure. I'll go first, Veena. I think there are two broad areas which I would like to, I keep telling myself this because, this is behavioral advice, which you can never say that you've got it sorted now. Number one is I can never overemphasize preparation. You need to be so well prepared. How much you prepare depends on how important the meeting is for you. It's as simple as that. So 1 minute or 1 hour or 1 day or 1 week of preparation is the way I look at it. The second is, and I think you mentioned it earlier in our discussion, which is look at the camera as often as possible. I have actually been trying to do this for close to a month, month and a half. And I have found that there is the next layer of challenge why that's difficult to do. There's one reason why it's difficult to do, which is that when you're looking at your computer screen, there are lots of distractions. Mm-hmm. And when you get distracted, then you look away from the camera. And I'm going to list the distractions for you. The first is other people on the screen. And you think you're looking at the other person doesn't know you're looking at them because they don't know where you are on their screen, right? So if I'm looking at you right now, you don't know that. You think I'm looking at something else. Number two distraction is your mobile phone. So if you look at your mobile phone when you're on the call, first of all, I would strongly recommend that do your video calls on your computer, not on your mobile phone. Computers are much better. They stay in one place. You've got a bigger screen. The camera is very clear. It doesn't keep moving and shaking all over the place. So computer over mobile phone any day. And don't look at your mobile phone. And by the way, everybody on your screen knows you're looking at your mobile phone when you are. You're not getting away with it, right? It's very clear. Use hand gestures because then number one, you express yourself better. Number two, when you're making a hand gesture, everybody knows you don't have your mobile in your hand and you're not doing something on your keyboard, right? So it's very clear that your entire attention is now on the screen. So, and last one, which I find very useful is remove your self-view from your Zoom call. We all have a tendency to look at ourselves. So remove your self-view. You are not conscious of yourself. You don't look at yourself. Firstly, you'll be looking at the camera. If not, at least you'll be looking at the other people on the screen and not at yourself. So these are my two broad areas of advice that I would say.
Thanks, Atul. Suman, would you like to go next?
Yeah,
maybe
I really like
the time in mind. Can we just maybe share one tip?
Oh, I just had 6, but anyway, maybe I
No,
should.
now you need to cut down to 1.
Okay, no, just kidding. So what am I going to say? I think it's very difficult as it's come out many a times. The other thing, Atul, you made a very nice point about, how things are really different when you're looking at the screen as opposed to, seeing somebody face to face. The other great leveler, I think, is, you might have a fancy corner office, right? But in the screen, you're just relegated to a corner. And you're also 1 inch by 1 inch, just like everybody else. So that itself changes the level playing, the field itself, right? It's a much more level playing field. Becomes much more difficult to actually show executive presence. Now, how do we handle that? I think we have to, because we don't have some of these other aspects which we had in the online world, we have to compensate. Right? And 2-3 things come to mind. One is, of course, the confidence. And it's also about, how present you are, whether you're making eye contact, all of that. Can't emphasize more on the communication part being concise and compelling. Very important. More so in the online world because you just have that much of window and that much of attention span. And once you build all that, I think it's important to read the room. And I have been doing a few, trainings, and I've also been conflicted earlier, but I feel that, end of the day, there may be more similarities than dissimilarities. End of the day, it comes down to the same things. Are you connected? Are you present? Are you listening to people? Are you reading the room? And if we can do that, I think we can be extremely successful virtually. In fact, somewhere I read very interesting statistic. They're saying, if you ask anybody, a 1-hour Zoom call is more tiring than a 1-hour conference room call. And the reason they're saying why that is so is that the human brain is wired to read body language. You're always trying to make sense of what the other person's body language is. So we are straining to look at those small windows and trying to see what the other person is saying. And I thought that was very interesting. So definitely we should not keep our videos off. We are hardwired to kind of pick up clues from other people through body language. Sorry, I went over one tip, but
yes, no issues. So Chitra, over to you. One last tip.
One thing that really stayed with me, and it sort of ties in a lot of things, is what Atul said early on. I think while we say watch for other behaviors and note patterns, it's also watch yourself. I think do a little bit of a pause and reflection soon after a meeting and make those notes, especially as we are learning new tips, tricks, and behaviors in a remote environment. I think it's helpful to understand even yourself and the way you have come across. So do that reflection and also take feedback about how you did in a meeting. I think there are a lot of tools like Mentimeter that help you do it. I think those would be helpful. Thanks.
Thanks, Chitra. So maybe one from my side as well. So of course, we've heard a lot about gravitas, appearance, and the communication part of it. So I think one thing which is very important, taking into account what's happening around us as well, right? The environment and being always back to back into this, this virtual meeting. It's so important to have that, bring in that strong energy, when you get connected in this virtual or the remote world, I feel. And when I say energy in terms of the way you communicate, your body language, your gestures, your confidence, and everything put together. And that actually creates so much of an impact and influence in terms of what you speak, and also the impact in terms of the way people perceive you and listen to you as well. So that's the tip. So for me, it's that energy, what you bring in the virtual world. Because I'm seeing from, for past few months, especially with what's happening outside, in terms of the environment. So when we are in the meeting, we generally, we are a little low. But, moment you put yourself in that with that strong energy, all of it, you forget, and then you are actually focused in terms of, what's happening in that meeting or the call or the conversation or whatever it is. And then you don't really realize whether you're sitting virtual. Say, for example, right now, we haven't met, Atul is far away in Delhi, but we really don't see that we are he's so much of distance. Yeah. So so that bringing that energy in the conversation is so very important. So with that, we've come to the end of our conversation. So maybe it's good to really understand what the audience want to ask. So Suman, if you don't mind, can you just open up the chat and help me out? Because for some reason, the chats are not showing to me when I rejoin this call.
Okay, so the first question is from Vijay. He says, it's a good perspective. However, isn't presence different from impact? The example of being present in a meeting room vis-a-vis creating an impact. So Atul, would you want to take that?
Sure. What I would say is presence is possibly one aspect or element of what leads to impact. What you're able to create through your presence will be one aspect. There will be multiple other aspects, as you were talking about in your framework, Suman. So yes, it is definitely different from impact, but possibly a subset.
Okay. So question for you, Chitra, this comes from Sri Lakshmi. She's asking, how do you manage to be attentive and present when you have back-to-back remote meetings? I think it's a very pertinent question. You tend to get more tired than you normally would in remote meetings.
Yeah. So thank you for your question, Sri Lakshmi. I think a couple of things here. One is try to see if you can at least get a 5-minute break between meetings to gather, collect yourself, go grab a glass of water, probably splash some water on your face also, just to freshen up. And I think that is important. And I think this can be brought about, for example, if you're working with the same set of people or otherwise also, try and build a set of working norms, that are mutually agreeable to everyone. And I think that shows a great degree of trust and respect for what, and pooling of ideas of how you want to run meetings efficiently. And yes, you do get tired. I think it's also okay to call it a day with meetings, because I think the ominous phrase "death by meetings" takes on a very new meaning now. So we have to be more conscious of time, and like Suman and Atul have said, preparedness, crisp and concise communication will always be helpful, and space it out. That's what I have seen in my experience. Don't rush to complete things. Allow for things to sit with people for a little while. Maybe instead of one face-to-face meeting, you may need 2 or 3 remote meetings now. But I think these are the few changes that you need to make to see that you can manage things a little better.
Great, thanks.
I saw
So
this. I'm just
Just to add to what Jitra said, if you don't mind, Suman.
No problem. I think Atul was saying something.
It's okay. It's okay. Please keep going.
Okay. Go ahead, Veena.
Yeah, so I think with this back-to-back meeting, I think it's not just with the virtual. I think it happens even when we are in the real, in the face-to-face environment as well, right? So I think it's important to have that pause, in between your calendar meetings, and which will help you to move. And I'll just share this. I just heard from my nephew's school. They've come up very intelligently in terms of the way they are scheduling their classes. They call it 20-20-20, where 20 minutes they actually do the class, and 20 minutes they give to the child in terms of really coming out of the virtual environment and doing something, with your hand or, that environment. And 20 minutes they actually, they take a break kind of a thing, where they move around. So I think the same logic applies to adults, or professionals like us. So if you are glued to the screen throughout the day, you are bound to get tired, and, your energy levels are going to dip. So design your day in a way that where you're also having pause in the break moments, where you're able to move your body, and move around a bit, and before you take the next call.
Great. So this next question, Veena, maybe you can take this. Akshat writes to us, he's had a problem with a boss, and maybe you can relate to this if you had a similar boss. So his problem was, how does one communicate with a boss who doesn't let his colleagues speak? I had a boss who always spoke over me. Even when I was talking my concerns to him, I had to stop talking and ignore my concerns, as I could not speak over him. So that's a good question. I think a lot of people have this issue. They have had bosses like this. So any tips from you, Veena?
So I'm sure all of us would have had bosses where, probably in a meeting room only they are creating presence and they're not letting others create presence, right? And but they forget the aspect of listening, which Suman, you brought it out, right? And the empathy. So I think even if your boss is like this, I think at least what's helped me is to draw the attention of your boss. And drawing the attention of your boss has to happen in multiple ways. Probably it could be in terms of the way you drive your content, or the way you drive your the project, or whatever it is. That's one aspect. And in the meeting, probably you say it in a very polite way, that sorry for interruption, and draw the attention and probably call out his name. That's always worked for me. So when you're in a meeting, if you call Suman, I have a point. So obviously, even if Suman is not letting me speak, moment I've spelled out his name loudly, he is going to stop there and let me speak. So that helps. I would say it's not just in the virtual world, it's also helped in me in the face-to-face world, actually.
This reminds me of a point somebody made the other day. We just talked about how people are not able to, sometimes they keep their videos off. And there was a boss who kept going on and on. At some point, it annoyed the employee, and he suddenly put his video off. And he said, so when asked, he said, I'm having bandwidth issues. Great example of, if the boss has really empathy to able to figure out that there is some signaling going on here, or is he tone deaf and just thinks it's really a bandwidth issue. So I think the online world also gives us a lot of these indicators where it's up to us to have that empathy and be connected and be present to pick up those signals. Yeah. I think, how are we doing on time? We just have 3 minutes
So
left.
we just have 3 minutes.
Yeah, so I think we are more or less done. Maybe
Do we have any more questions?
Well,
if you could go back to my question about Gravitas and whether it can be taught, learned, developed.
Absolutely, that's a definitely, let's do that. So your question was more around whether we can learn Gravitas. Is that right?
Is it possible to develop it if you don't have it as much as you think you want to have it or should have it?
So, I started by, I'll give you my quick response. I started by saying it's not a measure of performance, it's a measure of image. But having said that, gravitas per se is a lot of performance, because gravitas is, if you look at the elements of gravitas, a lot of it precedes you, right? So even before you enter a room, your reputation precedes you, right? Even if before you enter a room, people know whether you have vision, whether you have integrity, right? So all of these things precede you. So to that extent, the gravitas piece, I think, is a lot to do with leadership traits than just image. That's my sense.
So just to add to what Suman said, go ahead, Suman.
No. So just to finish, so I think short answer is, just like we say leadership traits can be learned. It's not that you're a born leader. This can be learned. So I think the elements of gravitas can definitely be learned. Of course, it's tough. And it requires us to have that, that awareness. I think it starts with self-awareness. Like to Chitra's point, right? Are you reflecting at the end of the meeting? Hey, what did I do? How could I improve it? And that comes from a deep, the willingness to kind of change and be able to reflect and empathize and maybe ask for feedback. So all those things. But if you do all that, I'm sure it's learnable.
So I do see a question which has just come from Rizwana. Has it come to me privately? Being the youngest PM and a lady PM, it's always becoming difficult to manage senior stakeholders as they overrule my space and meeting by their rapport. Okay, I always try to push myself to learn and compete every time, but this is going never ending. You have any feedback for me? So I think it's related to the other question in terms of, the boss, where he doesn't let the others speak. And so maybe, here you're feeling that you've been singled out because you are probably the only, because of the gender. I mean, I'm not sure. So so gender, I would always say when it comes to a women, when we speak about leadership presence and presence for women, it is very, very important, because there you will find interruptions. People may not really hear you, but it is important that you draw your attention. So it's important for you to show that confidence, competence, your voice, your body language, all of it is extremely important, and where you're able to draw your attention. So if someone is really singling you out because of your gender, it's always good to go and do that one-on-one with that person and really understand, and have that conversation. So not really have a conflicting conversation, really have that conversation, and I'm trying to understand where they're coming from. And I'm sure, this would help, but don't give up just because, people are, you're surrounded by people who are bossy. Don't give up. Continue to, persevere the way you're doing at the moment.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. And just to add to that, Veena, I think we should also mention that we do women leadership programs where, you bring in the gender lens as well. And because EP has a lot to do with bias, so the gender bias becomes also very critical. Like, to give you an example, one of the elements of Gravitas, which is decisive, research is showing that if woman is same kind of decisiveness can often be misread, right? In a woman, she can be seen as pushy, whereas the
Ask
same
me and Chitra.
Exactly. So, but that at the same time, so they may have to kind of fine tune their response, but at the same time, women in general have higher emotional intelligence, right? So that kind of gets compensated. Okay, thank you all for taking time out, and I hope this was useful. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Atul. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.